Putin is escalating his hybrid war against Europe with drone incursions and repeated violations of NATO airspace. At the same time, Russia continues its brutal war in Ukraine while testing the West's resolve. In Washington, Donald Trump has shifted his rhetoric, moving from calls for negotiations to declarations that Ukraine can and should regain all its territory. But will words be followed by real policy? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Stephen Pifer, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you for joining me, Mr. Pifer.
Happy to be here.
So, Mr. Pifer, everybody now is discussing the recent statements of the American president. First, what he said in New York at the UN General Assembly, then afterwards, after meeting with the Ukrainian President Zelensky. How do you see Trump's recent change of his position from calling for negotiations to strongly supporting Ukraine's full return of territory? Or we, from your perspective, should more pay attention to that Trump has changed not his rhetoric about Ukraine, but how he's speaking differently about Putin now?
Yeah. Well, I think the change in President Trump's rhetoric is welcome. And what I believe is it reflects his growing frustration that he's now set, I believe, 5 deadlines for Putin and Russia to change course to move to try to end a war with Ukraine. And in each case, Russia has not changed course. It's done nothing. And so I think he's frustrated. So I think that the change in rhetoric is a positive step. But the big question, and I don't yet have the answer, does President Trump intend to follow that change in rhetoric with a change in action? Because there are things that he could and that he should do that would help Ukraine, but also would put more pressure on the Kremlin to negotiate in good faith to try to find a solution. And at this point, we don't know.
What kind of solutions you could see at this point? What concrete steps could follow after that?
Yeah, well, I think one step would be to tighten sanctions on Russia to put more pressure on the Russian economy. And you could do this by tightening pressure to restrict revenues that Russia gets from its sales of oil abroad. You could take steps to close loopholes because, unfortunately, still a significant amount of American and Western high-tech products are getting into Russia, often via third countries. To close off that, that would, I think, impact the Russian economy. He could ask Congress for money for Ukraine so that we were not just selling weapons to Europeans to give to Ukraine, but we were actually providing weapons ourselves directly to Ukraine. And those sorts of things would face Putin with the fact that if this war continues, the costs for Russia are only going to get higher and higher. So I think there are things that he could do. There are things that have been obvious that he could have done any time over the last 6 or 7 months, but he seems to be reluctant to do this. And while I hope he will act in a way to put pressure on the Kremlin, I fear that he may be positioning himself, and you saw in one of the comments he made a couple of days ago that really the burden for solving this now is going to be on Ukraine and Europe. And I wonder if he's going to try now to sort of just wash his hands of this and sort of admit that he has failed in his effort to find a diplomatic solution. I hope I'm wrong, but that seems to be what he may be doing.
Yes, but Mr. Pifer, do you agree that Trump has no desire to impose any sanctions against Russia?
Well, we've seen now he's been in office and he's been talking about greater sanctions and consequences for Russia if Russia did not change course now since, I believe, April. So that's 5 months now. Yet every time Russia misses a deadline, Trump does not impose any kind of penalties. This is not the way to deal with the Kremlin. I mean, Vladimir Putin, every time he hears a threat now from Trump, I think Putin just says, I don't have to pay any attention to it because Trump in the past has never done anything to back up his words with actions. And that's unfortunate because that weakens American diplomacy. I think it makes President Trump look like a weak player on the international scene. And it's unfortunate because I do believe that if Trump were prepared to use his leverage, he might actually achieve his goal of trying to find some kind of a solution to the Russian-Ukraine war. But he's not been using the leverage that he has to try to bring a new change in position by the Russians, and therefore his diplomacy is on a course to fail.
Mr. Pifer, but in general, how would you evaluate the diplomacy relationship between Kyiv and the Washington at this stage, after the Oval Office scandal situation, after the recent meeting with Donald Trump, European leaders, and Zelensky? And now we see, like, not only Zelensky in New York, but also Melania Trump met with the First Lady of Ukraine, and they have also very important discussions about returning Ukrainian children. So how would you evaluate the situation right now?
Well, certainly after the Oval Office ambush of President Zelensky in February, I think things are much improved between Washington and Kyiv at the senior level. But what you've seen by President Trump are a couple of positive steps. One, he's agreed to sell, not to provide, but to sell NATO weapons that NATO can then pass on to Ukraine. That's a positive step, but that compares unfavorably to what the previous administration did, where the Biden administration secured from Congress $80 billion in military assistance to give to Ukraine. The second thing that I think we still don't have a full understanding of is that after the meeting that took place in August between President Trump, President Zelensky, and the 7 other European leaders, there was this question of Britain and France putting together a coalition of the willing force that would deploy troops on the ground in Ukraine. And while Trump said that he would not include Americans in that, he did say that he might be prepared to backstop that force with American air power. So that's this question that I think still has not been resolved. And I assume it's under discussion, but we haven't heard much about that since August.
Yeah, and just let's shift to the question about Russian provocation into the European countries' airspace. Well, it's happening kind of every week. Well, the latest war in Denmark, the previous was in Lithuania, in Poland, definitely. How do you see the NATO response to Russia's violation of the airspace?
Well, it's interesting to me that you see more of these violations, which I think are really Russia testing NATO, more of these violations after the Alaska meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin. And this is, in a way, I think, a test of Trump as well. And I believe NATO has to come up with a better response than they've done so far. You had the 19 drones fly into Poland about 2 weeks ago. 1 or 2 might have been a mistake, an accident, but 19, that's a planned action. And then followed up by the MiG-31 flights through Estonian airspace, and then these other drone flights that are taking place around Europe. NATO's being tested, and I think NATO needs to come up with a firmer response. What the Russians are doing here, I think, is dangerous, but I think it becomes more dangerous if the Russians believe that they can get away with it, because you'll see further and further tests that might reach a point where you then have kind of a real clash that neither side wants.
And then the additional question, testing for what? For the ability to respond, for the ability to defend themselves, for what?
Yeah, I would think that there are probably 2 objectives. One is by doing these kinds of flights, they're gathering information. They want to know how well NATO air defenses work. Can NATO air defenses track the drones? Can they track the fighters? But the second thing is, again, basically to make NATO look weak, to show that they can do these sorts of games, these provocations, and get away with it. And again, it seems to me that NATO needs to come together and come up with a firmer response to try to stop these provocations, because if it does not, they're only going to continue, and they might get worse.
Yeah, in the Ukrainian social media, the information regarding this Russia's incursions, invasions into European countries' airspace is spreading, and people are afraid that European leaders will stop helping Ukraine after that and funding Ukraine, because they would rearm and they would spend money for themselves. What do you think about that?
I actually don't share that concern.
Okay.
I have been very impressed by the European response to supporting Ukraine. Had you told me in February of 2022 that in late 2025 there would be a weaker response to Ukraine, I would have thought that might have come from Europe, not from the United States. And unfortunately, and I wish it were otherwise, I see the American response to supporting Ukraine being weak. But it seems to me that the Europeans have now come to appreciate that what happens in Ukraine matters very much for their security. And I think European leaders understand that if Russia wins in Ukraine, Russia becomes a much more dangerous country on the border of NATO Europe. So I'm actually fairly confident that the Europeans are prepared to continue supporting Ukraine, and they're prepared to continue doing that even if Trump basically decides to take the United States out of the game. This is, I think, one thing that the Europeans now, I think, should be considering, I think they are considering, are there ways to use the frozen Russian central bank assets? And I think there's a plan that's being discussed now, a fairly clever plan, that would allow a large portion of those funds to be made available to Ukraine. That, to my mind, is important, because if Ukraine has those funds, then Ukraine knows that for the next several years, it will have the resources to buy the weapons it needs to continue defending themselves. That would be a very important message to the Kremlin. If Vladimir Putin realizes that for the next 3, 4, 5 years, Ukraine will have the ability to arm itself to keep continuing to wage its defensive fight against the Russians, then Putin has to ask himself, is he prepared to sustain the continuing economic pressure? But more importantly, is he continue to pay a price of 300, 400, 500,000 Russian soldiers killed and wounded every year? Mm-hmm. That might cause a change in the Kremlin's approach.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Pifer, do you believe that lots of Russia's friends, Putin friends, actually don't want him to win this war in Ukraine?
So which friends are we talking about here?
Well, which friends? Okay. China. Okay, not friends. Let's call them allies. Let's call them whoever they are. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think China is supporting Russia, and China's trying to find a very fine line here because it wants to support Russia. I think the calculation in Beijing is that to the extent the United States and the West are distracted in supporting Ukraine, it's less Western pressure on China. But I think the Chinese also are trying to find a way where they can do that without triggering a very negative response from the Europeans or from the Americans. Bear in mind that while China's annual trade with Russia is about $200 billion a year, China's annual trade with the United States is $600 billion a year, and it's another $600 billion a year with Europe. So China's trying to find that path. On the other hand, I think if Putin were to make a decision to end the war, I don't think the Chinese would object.
In the mid of September, Keith Kellogg was in Kyiv during the Yalta European Strategy Conference. For those who not know, it's just a huge European conference with a lot of world leaders, prime ministers, presidents coming to Kyiv, professors, historians. So, and you know, Mr. Pifer, in Ukraine, we're saying that when he's coming to Kyiv, we're saying Kellogg's night, which means like when he's here, we can sleep without bombarding Ukrainian cities. And that's ironically and kind of a sad, but this is the reality we have. So, and during this conference, he said that he and his generals told to Trump that Russia is not winning on the battlefield. Could this statement influence Trump's position, well, the one that we see right now?
Well, first of all, let me say I agree very much with General Kellogg. I mean, I think and in fact, I'll be giving a talk in a couple of days where I'll say one of the myths of this war is that Russia is winning on the battlefield. If you look at what Russia occupies today, about 19% of Ukraine, that's 1/3 less than Russia occupied back in March of 2022. And the Russians have paid a horrific cost for this. Over 1 million soldiers killed and wounded in action. So I look at that and I look at the Russians have made some minor gains, but it's very slow and it's great cost. So I look at that and say, you really cannot say that Russia is winning this war. Now, whether that impacts on President Trump's view, I'm just not sure. It's very hard for me to figure out how Mr. Trump arrives at his policies because it's hard to see whether there's a strategy or a plan. It just seems to be based on his gut instinct, which changes from day to day. I mean, if you look at the flip-flops we've seen, so what he said when he was in Alaska meeting with Putin, what he then said 3 days later when he was meeting with President Zelensky and European leaders, completely different. There's no strategy here. And so it's hard to figure out how you can persuade him to adopt a strategy.
Yeah, at this YES conference, Radoslav Sikorsky said that stop just listening every word of American president, every tweet, every his post. But maybe may I just refer to another statement of Keith General Kellogg. He said, I just wrote it down, don't fear Russia's army. This isn't the USSR. If Putin rattles nukes, remind him the US, Britain and France are nuclear too. We would kick their ass. I don't know whether I can say that on air, but I'm quoting in my defense. Yeah. So, is that a source of a reassurance what he said when dealing with Russia?
Yeah, no, to be sure, Russia has a large nuclear arsenal, but, the Russians aren't crazy. And I think there is a basic understanding in Moscow that if you use nuclear weapons, you've opened a Pandora's box, and the consequences are unpredictable, they're nasty, and they're potentially catastrophic, including for Russia. And I think the Russians understand that. And it was interesting to me, I believe that the Russian, sort of the period of maximum Russian threat with nuclear questions was back in September of 2022, after Putin said that he had annexed Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, even though the Russian army didn't control all of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And then he made this statement in September that they would use all of their forces to defend those territories. I understand that there was one assessment within the U.S. government that there was a 50% chance that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. It didn't happen. And I think it didn't happen for several reasons. One, the Ukrainian government made clear that this is an existential fight Ukraine would fight on. The West, and I understand that the United States, Britain, and France communicated private messages to the Russians that there would be very severe consequences if Russia used nuclear weapons. But then also, I think you had the Chinese and the Indians and others in the global South going to the Russians and saying, you can't do that. And what was interesting to me was within a month of September 22, Vladimir Putin is at the Valdai Discussion Club, and he's asked about the threats. And he said, we don't make nuclear threats. That's just Western propaganda. A week later, the Russian Foreign Ministry put out a statement on prevention of nuclear war, which was about 95% of what I would have wanted to see the Russians say. And then 3 weeks after that, Foreign Minister Lavrov is at the G20 summit in Bali, and he agrees to language that says nuclear threats are unacceptable. So I think the Russians have tried to play this nuclear card, but at the end of the day, the threats that they're making simply are not credible. And while the West cannot ignore those threats, I also think it would be a mistake to put too much attention on them, because the Russians at the end of the day understand that if you let the nuclear genie out of the bottle in war, things can get very nasty very, very quickly.
I'm referring to the YES conference again because I had a chance to talk with Gabrielius Landsbergis, where he said that Europe doesn't have any plan. Well, they do have plan B and plan C in kind of a Russia threat, but all these plans, they are not including Ukraine's victory. So my questions to you, not about the Europe's plan B, but rather Ukrainian plan B. If NATO, not the option for us, at least till 2029, do you see any stable financial support from Europe and the US, probably to us?
Yeah, well, it seems to be that when you talk, I think that there needs to be a very firm security guarantee for Ukraine. And you can do this, I think, in several ways. I believe that it would be a very good security guarantee for Ukraine to bring Ukraine into NATO. Moreover, as I think the Ukrainians have shown, Ukraine and NATO would not be just a consumer of NATO security. Ukraine would be a provider of security. I think if you look at NATO countries in Ukraine, Ukraine by far has the largest, most battle-hardened, tested military of any of those countries. Now, I think it's going to be difficult exactly how you bring them in and what timing. And of course, as you say, there's a problem until 2029 because at least President Trump is not in favor of the idea. Although I would note, if you go back to the 2023 NATO summit, which was NATO's last formal pronouncement on Ukraine, it said Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership. And Mr. Trump can't change that without getting the consensus of NATO members. And I think there are a lot of members of NATO who agree that Ukraine ultimately should be in the alliance. Another security guarantee, though, that we might consider is that the West provides in the event of a settlement, and not only does the West arm Ukraine to continue to the war, but if there's a settled, modern, well-equipped military entirely under Ukrainian control, that could help deter the Russians. And then I also think that there's a possibility for this idea of a British-French-led force of the willing that would actually put a reassurance force into Ukraine with some kind of American backstop. That may be a possibility as well. So I think there are things that you could do that would be solid guarantees for Ukraine that might happen even if NATO membership cannot happen for another several years.
Yeah, well, true. Mr. Pifer, thank you for your time. Thank you for your brilliant thoughts. And I hope to see you again and to listen to you again.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day.